Is that fundamentally we're looking at an inability or a disagreement about what it means to be human. And then it gets more complex when you have to then push into the question, what does it mean to be Cameron? And I have to ask the question, what does it mean to be Nathan? So, in a culture that can't answer the broad and general version of it, it's very difficult to get around to answering the specific version of it.
Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
Well, Nathan, it's not exactly New Year's Day or anything like that, but the new year is in its infancy. And
A little baby 2023.
correct. And I thought that we could talk about something that a lot of people not resolutions. Let's get that out of the way. We're not going to talk about New Year's.
Well, we're going to refer to him.
Perhaps in passing, but that's not the main subject. What I wanted to discuss with you, Nathan, is the notion that, hey, it's a new year, it's a clean slate, I can reinvent myself. I get to start over again. So
Well, because January 1st is a magical time.
it's a magical time. And
I mean, I don't believe that, but it's interesting how we kind of just pick that as reset. I guess it makes sense.
reset, yeah, a lot of people do think of it as a reset, but I want to challenge that assumption with you and instead propose to our listeners that if you're thinking along those lines, and it makes sense, that's the air we breathe, what about reconsidering and thinking about discovering who you are rather than reinventing or restarting or constructing? Think about discovering who you are. I mean, just that notion alone contains a lot of countercultural assumptions. But yeah, I cut you off there.
We'll have to work through this because I know over the years you and I have spoken about this differently because there's a lot of because I often talk about remembering who you are and you often talk about discovering who you are, and I think we're meaning the same thing but coming at it from slightly different angles in the sense that lots of people discover who they are um in the sense of finding who they are that's the true them within themselves, and that's exactly not what you're talking about. So there's a Christian version of discovering who you are, and then there's a self-optimization, your true inner self discovering who you are, and those are very different things.
Well, no, so implicit in the notion of discovery, and I suppose its most basic sense would be that this is not something you've made. You don't discover what you invent. You find it. So that means that there is a givenness to your identity. And I think the cultural assumption is that your identity is a little bit more fluid and you have a massive hand in basically making yourself. I do think that you
Well,
have a
see, but
hand in. Yes,
that's where I think resolutions come in, though, is because people are resolving to make themselves into some type of image.
correct. But
Yeah.
again, if there's a givenness to you, if you have been made rather than self-made, then it would follow that if you want to discover who you really are, and if you want to come into your own, so to speak, you would need to get in touch with your maker rather than some ideal that's popped into your head or some cultural fad or trend. Does that make sense?
Oh no, yeah, it definitely does. I'm trying to think what the other side of the well, okay, so let's just broaden it out there to make sure we're on the same page. So in the sense that you might have an ideal body image that you're looking for, an ideal weight, a new hobby you want to learn, something like that. And so you set up, and oftentimes January 1st is the time in which you embark on these things. You set up goals for yourself to become a certain type of being in a certain way. And what we're saying is everybody by and large does that. The only differentiation is the way something that is the way that you want to be something that you're purely in control of, or is it something that you have yet to become that's what you were made to be. So it's a conformity to a standard. It's all just a question of where the standard comes from.
Yeah, the word standard is important because that would imply again that you have some kind of telos or design or intrinsic purpose. And I think that well, I don't think that's what our culture would question because they would see that as an imposition on
Well,
your
so
own will.
you have to believe that there is such a thing as a meaning and a purpose,
R-
which I mean that comes back to you've been saying that a lot in a lot of last podcast is that fundamentally we're looking at an inability or a disagreement about what it means to be human, and then it gets more complex when you have to then push into the question, what does it mean to be Cameron? And I have to ask the question, what does it mean to be Nathan? So in a culture that can't answer the broad and general version of it, it's very difficult to get around to answering the specific version of it. But that is totally possible.
Yeah, and I think this is this is a line of thinking that I mean a lot of Christians drift into it because once again, we're just surrounded by it. It is the air we breathe. And we forget that no, you haven't your life is imbued with intrinsic perfect purpose and significance. Now, of course, we play a hand in what we become. That's part of the awesome responsibility with which human beings are
Well, that's
endowed.
be well, and that's part of being made in the image
That
of
is,
God
yes.
is an inherent responsibility, a reflection, reciprocation, relational element to it. So, yeah, the ability of participation in creation that's pretty neat and scary.
It is. Yeah, there's that plastic element to human life where you really are you're a transformable creature for better or for worse. And so if there's so there are two I think it's important to state two important ideas here because they can seem to be paradoxical or even they can run the risk of sounding contradictory. So on the one hand, I'm talking about you and I are talking about human beings as made by God and endowed with
Hmm.
intrinsic purpose and design and telos. So there is a way Nathan Rittenhouse ought to be. There's a way Cameron McAllister ought to be because both were made by God and for God.
Yeah, there's
But
an
Nathan
oughtness to our
Rittenhouse,
lives.
right. So there's that. There's the intrinsic significance. We'll call it that piece. But then there's and Nathan and Cameron and you, dear listener, also play a part in what you become. So you're active and you're a
Well,
participant with regard to your identity as well. Both are happening simultaneously. Ideally speaking,
well, this
yeah,
this is where people are going to throw some flags on the play here because our
right.
theology can start to get messy. So, um, I remember when our friend Xandra Carroll and I were doing a talk somewhere on the environment, and we made a suggestion that we are co-participants in in stewarding and in our impact on the planet and environmental. Like we can, like for can people have an impact on the environment from a Christian perspective? The answer to that is absolutely yes. That's what we were created for. So that shouldn't surprise us that we can. Now, whether it's good or bad, that's a whole different ball of wax. But the people wrote in and were upset about the fact that we talked about co-participation and felt like that was crossing major theological boundaries because what do you do with the sovereignty of like if God is sovereign, then people aren't responsible. And that say something about that because that's not the correct view of sovereignty or the biblical anthropology there. But I think people get hung up on saying, well, this is just the way that I am. And I don't have a responsibility in it because this is how God made me and it's all up to him. And so, what do I have in it?
Yeah, I mean, and of course, co-participants is deeply theological language and flows directly from in the case of what you both were talking about, the creation mandate. Yes, but see, this is where your theological commitments are not just purely abstract or ivory tower commitments. They do have practical outworkings.
Mhm.
And I'm going to, yes, so I'm going to make some suggestions here. And the listeners, there's going to be a spectrum of responses to a question like the one you just raised. And it's, again, what we want to do is get the wheels turning. Think this over. But I would suggest that the notion that God's sovereignty, which is indisputable, this is part of scripture and part of God's word
This is
and
coming to you from a Presbyterian.
right. So God's sovereignty is not in question. But the notion that God's sovereignty necessarily cancels out all human freedom, I would suggest is a crude reading of God's sovereignty. If you want to be faithful to the full scope of scripture, you'll see that human beings exercise freedom. And if you look into the original reformers, John Calvin, Luther, they make room, complex room for for human freedom. Now, human freedom in a purely libertarian sense, some modern notions of human freedom, they would have a problem with, but a lot of actually classical philosophical thinkers would have a problem with certain modern views of,
Yeah,
human free will as pure, you know, unpremised, freedom to do whatever one spontaneously wants to do. But God's sovereignty does not preclude human moral agency. I mean, we make moral choices, and those choices have a profound effect on our lives, and we face profound consequences on the basis of those choices. So,
mhm.
part of the way the Lord, I mean, another way of phrasing the matter, if this is more comfortable for you, is that the Lord has orchestrated or ordained matters such that you have a degree, you exercise as a creature a degree of freedom. And part of your freedom consists in your moral choices. And your moral choices play a part in what you become. So I don't
Yeah.
know if I've
So,
muddied the waters or helped a little bit here, Nathan.
uh, well, let me just jump right into this mud puddle. So do you think that when you said the reformers, which I mean, I don't know that it's fair to blame the reformers or give them total credit for articulations of the sovereignty of God. Certainly, in the Western way in which we think about it, I guess a lot of that conversation started there with bondage of the will and other
Sure.
things they were trying to work out at that time. But I think all Christians have had all Orthodox Christians have had a high view of the sovereignty of God, regardless of their
Absolutely.
theological
Yep.
tradition. Um, and Catholicism and Orthodoxy, big O Orthodoxy there have all acknowledged that as well. Do you think that some of the pushback against a libertarian concept of freedom is that the modern iteration of that is where freedom kind of is the goal?
I think,
So we
yeah.
so the "don't tread on me" element plays over into our theology of to be free is the highest good. I live in a state. Our motto is "Mountaineers are always free." Look at New Hampshire's state motto: "Live free or die." You know, freedom. Just need an American flag and a bald eagle screaming and some fighter jets going over. Huzzah! Right? And so there is that celebration of freedom that, from a political structure and concept of freedom, I would like, shoot, yeah, sign me
Mhm.
up. However, we have to be careful in transposing that back onto our theological concepts of what it means to be free. Um, because even if you look at the political nature of that, the freedom was for a purpose. It wasn't just in order to be free.
Yeah.
So that seems to me to be where the rub is there of not it's not a question of whether or not freedom is good, it's whether or not freedom is the highest good, and if you're free to do something else, then, okay, that raises some bigger questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are 2 things going on there. There's the notion that modern freedom is purely negative for the most part, just freedom from all constraint, which leaves out a positive vision of freedom. Well, freedom for what? Freedom to be what? So there's that issue. I think the deeper issue that a lot of some of the people who would resist a purely libertarian view of free will is that if you're not careful, it becomes a form of idolatry because ultimately
Mhm.
speaking, the one being who is purely free, unpremised in this, and can and has that degree of awesome freedom to say I am that I am would be God. And I think a lot of reformers and other incisive thinkers looked at, for instance, the Enlightenment project and saw in it some clearly idolatrous aspirations to make humanity the measure of all things. And the idea that we would be rational people in control of our destiny, and we would do whatever we wanted, all in the name of freedom. That was a vision of freedom that I think we look at that now and say it was both idolatrous and quite naive, because also human beings are not free in that way. We're
Well,
yeah,
yeah, and is there a sense in which, like, the half of the point of Ecclesiastes is to say it just doesn't work for meaning?
right, and I
I
mean,
mean, if you wanted somebody who didn't have external constraints and tried about whatever they wanted, there's but we kind of intuitively or experientially know that that's true as well. So, let me complicate this one step further, and I think this will bring us back to some clarity and get us back on the topic that you originally had us on. So, on the question of you talked about God being free, um, and because sometimes there's the question of like, God, does God have moral obligations? Like, are there things that God has to do in order to be who He is? And so, I was thinking about this one morning when I woke up, scribbled this down on my nightstand. Is that it seems to me that total freedom is when you're only bound by your own character. And so there's a sense in which God does not have moral obligations, but there are things that God will always do, not because of an external set of standards or restraints, but because of the consistency of his own character and who he is. And so if that definition of freedom is true, then true freedom is when your behavior is bound only by your own character, which for the Christian is to be conformed into the image of Christ. And so when Jesus says, and the truth will set you free, there is a Christ-like version of Nathan that experiences the maximal pleasure of what it means to be me as a derivative of completely following what it is that Christ has for me to be. But it's important that we get those in their proper order, that it's the transformation, the metamorphosis of my character
mhm,
into the image of Christ that produces the most free. Doesn't even almost sound right there, but it is in
mhm,
the technical sense in which we're speaking about it, the most free version of what it means to be me. And you see that work out on how did people forgive the people who were killing them? How did people turn the other cheek? How did people bless those who cursed them? Because there was a freedom there that came not from the freedom that they experienced was not based off of the action of other people. So even in a miserable situation, what they felt, Paul and Silas singing in prison, they were literally constrained and had freedom. It's just a beautifully wild reality.
yes, and it again, it flies in the face of all of our assumptions, and the way to that form of liberty is taking up one's cross. Again, something else that has a sort of paradoxical character to it, but I think it makes good practical sense too. Let me spell this out for you, and it will take
Ooh,
us
pragmatism.
yeah, well, and it will take us into the heart of a lot of the tragedy of our cultural moment, I think. If you try to live only for yourself, your own whims and wishes, what's at the end of that road? Now, sadly, many of us know exactly what's at the end of that road: loneliness, isolation, bitterness, because you end up not being able to sustain any relationships in your life. If you live only for yourself, if you live a life of no compromise, then you're going to find that it's tremendously lonely. Now, if there's one thing that punctuates our cultural moment, it's loneliness and alienation. And that's no surprise to me, because a huge part of the air we breathe is it just tells you to focus entirely on what you want and to prioritize your own needs and wishes over others. And there's a great deal of therapeutic language now that's used in the service of selfishness as well. And
Self-care, Cameron.
right.
It's the rage.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, and the idea that you would always prioritize yourself, that you would, or that you would, I mean, even think about something like, and that this has gotten some criticism in recent years, and as it should have. Human relationships are very difficult, and the word toxicity is overused, but sometimes it can be accurate. But think about the notion of just rid yourself of all toxic persons. All right. If you do that though, that can become, I'm not saying that there aren't circumstances where you'll need to impose some distance, need to set some boundaries. Of course, that's human life. But pushing away all quote toxic people is also can be an excuse to never work through any real problems. And no matter who you're dealing with, whether it's a family member or a friend or a spouse, you will come to those extremely difficult junctures in the road because all human beings are flawed and fallen. And if you have if you have a commitment to never budge on anything and never work through those deep problems, you're going to be terribly lonely. Now, on the other
Yeah, so
hand,
is
yeah,
no, I was just gonna get your thoughts on this before you move on to the other hand. Because there's a sense in which, like, there's a bit of, like, the asceticism of, like, "I'm gonna go live in solitude and sit on a pillar in the desert," kind of thing. Like, that gets rid of all toxic relationships, I guess. Um, but is not the point of the incarnation is that we step into the difficulty of the world around us in a redemptive way, an invitational way. So there seems to be a bit of an element that if we embraced that, would be saying that the difficulty of on this so we can fill in the blank with anything, but you've picked relationships here, is that those the difficulty of working through that is part of the formation of me into who God wants me to be. So you can't actually seems like pretty early on somebody said it's not good for man to be alone. You
mhm,
know, so
yeah,
I mean, there's a sense in which there. I guess all I'm saying is, in stuttering around to get to it, is that the difficulty that we often try to avoid is often the mechanism by which the Lord is trying to teach us the thing that we need to know in
mhm,
order to move on.
yes, but you have to you have to then overcome the notion that you should feel good all the time. That's one of the central lies of our age right now, because actually life will be filled with difficulty, and part of the purpose and that difficulty and that pain do serve a redemptive role, can serve a redemptive role, but that requires our cooperation. And so that's where that adage pain can make you better or bitter comes from. There's
Hmm.
real truth to that, actually. But also it will require trust of you, trust in our Lord, that He will see you through any circumstance and that you can grow as you press into the difficulties of life and aim to be an agent of change for the better. So and again, so now pressing into that difficulty, if you live your life ironically, if you live your life dedicated to avoiding all pain and all adversity, you will experience tremendous amounts of pain, much more so. If you live for others to the best of your abilities with the empowerment of God's Spirit and aim to live selflessly, you will your joy will increase. You'll have a lot of difficulties, but your joy will increase and you will discover more who you are in the process. By
Hmm.
pursuing God and
Well,
others, you'll discover who you actually are. If you try to live only for yourself and make yourself, you'll lose yourself.
so okay, let's take all that and then turn the corner here. It is the first of the year. People are going to be making resolutions, and setting goals is not a bad idea,
No.
or having a plan. Or um, so hey, let's say somebody sets a goal, that you know what, I want to get out of credit card debt this year. That is a fantastic goal. You should do that, because you don't want to be indebted to whatever financial institution or lifestyle you're stuck in that's put you in this miserable spot. It's a huge waste of money, and it's not a good form of stewardship. And so there are lots of biblical principles and biblical advisors out there to help you get out of that and do that. But the point is not to be free of credit card debt; it's to be able to use your money wisely and correctly, um, and to be a contributor and a gifter and a giver and somebody who is productive. So there's that. Okay, what else do people make resolutions about? Exercise and their physical health. That's great.
Mhm.
Do that. Be a good steward of the physical body that the Lord has given you. And again, It's not to say, hey, you know what, I should get to myself to a healthy weight or exercise in a way that my body is strong. Good thing. But the goal of that is not to say, well, now I look great and feel good about myself. It's to say, now I have the body that will enable me to continue to serve the Lord well. And so think about like, what's the flip side, the positive version of the vision of the thing that you're trying to
Mhm.
overcome during this phase of life, because it's much easier to sustain a goal or a resolution if there's a positive thing that you're growing into for a purpose rather than just something you're doing for the short term in order to counteract a negative. And so that, yeah, I don't know. Makes sense in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, we need to be animated by a positive vision rather than just rigid discipline. Discipline is a means to an end. But yeah,
Yeah.
if you have
Mhm.
a goal, I always like Dallas Willard. Here he is. Here's Dallas Willard. We
Oh,
had
there he was.
there he is.
The daily double.
The Daily Double. Well, Dallas Willard's notion of vision, intention, means vim. You need a vision, you need the intention to arrive at that vision, and then you need the means, practical steps on how to achieve that, whether that's getting
Mhm.
out of credit card debt or getting into physical shape, whatever it is that you've set as your goal. And so part of this has been a long kind of meandering discussion, even though it's, we're technically clocking in a little bit. We're ending things sooner than we usually do here, so I guess it's not been that long. But part of the proposal here that we hope is constructive and helpful is just that instead of focusing only on the notion of a quote new you, maybe entertain the thought that the Lord will recover the fact that God has made you. And if He has indeed made you, then there's an intrinsic meaning and purpose to your life. And think about how you go about discovering that. And think about how the more you live your life in conformity with your Lord, the more you will discover true freedom and discover who you actually are rather than just trying to reinvent yourself once again.
Yeah, I have an assignment. If you want a practical thing to practice, look at the beginning of Galatians chapter 6. This would be a good way to start the new year. And there's this, so listen to the apparent paradox that's in this. Brothers, if someone is caught in a sin, you who are spiritual should restore him gently, but watch yourself, or you may also be tempted. Verse 2, carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. If anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. Each one should test his own actions, then he can take pride in himself without comparing himself to somebody else. For each one should carry his own load. And so in verse 2, you have each one should carry their own burden. And in verse 5, you had for each one should carry his own load. So what in the world is going on there? There seems like a contradiction. It's not. Um, but I think one of the neat things that we can do as Christians as we think about moving forward is to figure out what are the loads that you are meant to carry and what are the loads and the burdens in which you need a community to help you. And then what are the communities that you're a part of that help other people carry the loads that they can't carry for themselves? And so some of this, I just want to give us this reminder as we leave is that when we're talking about being conformed to an image or a goal or being who we are, um, to use Cameron's word of discovery there, that often is collective and communal in addition to just individual. And so, yes, allow the Lord to work on you and to challenge you and to convict you and to grow you in order that you can be part of a group of people who does these things well, because that's ultimately what the church is about and what you're created for, to be part of that fellowship and part of the kingdom. So there's a neat thing here where I think part of maturing spiritually is to recognize to say, I'm in over my head. I need some help here. I need some financial counseling. I need some counseling on sexual addiction. I need some counseling. I need some help with fill in the blank, whatever it is there. Exercise, whatever. Do it. Get help on that. And then to think of the other things that are like, you know what? Nope. I can get out of bed on time by myself and when I'm 30 and go to work. Like that is a burden the size that I can bear. And so part of us growing and maturing is to be able to properly understand that. And the biggest difficulty there, I think, for probably most of us listening to this conversation today, is not on the individual lean in and get it done myself. It's about having the humility to allow other people to help me get there. And so there's this sense in which, yes, we're being conformed into the likeness of Christ, but that means that since there is a standard there that we're all growing to and toward, that a lot of other people are on that journey together. And it can be a wonderfully beautiful thing when we do that together. So maybe be thinking about your resolves and your resolutions as collective pursuits, and you'll find some really sweet fellowship and helpful relationships along the way as you grow in that direction. So, yeah, just a little thought there, encouragement. Maybe ponder on the beginning of Galatians chapter 6 as you think about what it is that you as an individual, you as in your family, or you and your local fellowship want to be doing, recognizing that it's not just about not doing something, but it's about getting free of things in order to be like Christ for his glory and for our neighbor's good. And in doing that, I think we find a lot of fullness in what it means to be one of what it is that we are. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud. Happy New Year, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.